What is communism really? At its core, communism is an ideology that calls for the abolition of class divisions, private property, and social inequality. Marx and Engels envisioned a world where the working class, called the proletariat, would overthrow the ruling capitalist class known as the bourgeoisie and establish a society. Communism has long been a controversial and polarizing ideology. From its roots in the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to its real-world implementations, communism has sparked intense debate. Is it a path to equality and justice, or does it inevitably lead to oppression and failure? Let's strip away the myths and fears and take an honest look at communism, its promises, its pitfalls, and how history has shaped its reputation. In the mid-19th century, as the world was swept by the tides of industrial revolution and economic upheaval, two thinkers emerged whose ideas would reshape history. Karl Marx, a German philosopher with a keen eye for societal structures, and Friedrich Engels, a revolutionary and social scientist, began to dissect the growing divide between the wealthy elite and the struggling working class. Together, they penned the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a powerful call to arms for the proletariat, the working class. Their vision was radical, a world without class divisions where the means of production were collectively owned and where inequality was eradicated. Marx's seminal work, Das Kapital, would further explore the mechanisms of capitalism, laying bare its exploitation and predicting its eventual downfall. But communism was not just a theory confined to books. As the decades passed, leaders like Vladimir Lenin in Russia and Mao Zedong in China took Marx and Engels' ideas from the page to the world stage. Revolutions ignited, empires fell, and new nations were born under the red banner of communism. The dream of a classless society, however, faced challenges and transformations, adapting to the harsh realities of governance and power. The story of communism is one of ideals and realities, of utopian visions and complex legacies, a story that continues to influence political thought and movements even today. Communism, the ideology that promised equality, workers' rights, and a classless society. But why did this vision lead to some of the most intense geopolitical struggles of the 20th century? And why did the Western world respond with such fierce opposition? Let's break it down. The ultimate goal of communism was to create a classless, stateless society where resources and production were owned collectively. Under communism, wealth and power would be distributed based on need, eliminating economic inequality. The first major implementation of communism occurred in Russia. Following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Lenin led the way, establishing the Soviet Union. Later, leaders like Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong in China, and Fidel Castro in Cuba adopted and adapted communist principles to their own nations. Communist movements gained traction by appealing to the working class, promising land reform, workers' rights, and resistance against colonial or imperial powers. However, the transition to communism often involved violent revolutions, suppression of dissent, and centralized authoritarian governments. So, why did the West hate communism so much? There were several key reasons. Economic threat. Western, capitalist economies valued free markets and private ownership, directly opposing communist ideals. Political ideology. The West, especially the United States, championed democracy and individual freedoms, while communist states often turned into authoritarian regimes. The Cold War. After World War II, the world was essentially divided into two blocks: the capitalist West, led by the US, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The ideological, political, and military competition led to proxy wars, nuclear arms races, and intense espionage. Human rights concerns. Communist regimes, particularly under Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, were responsible for large-scale purges, famines, and political repression. Propaganda and fear. The West engaged in widespread propaganda campaigns, leading to events like the Red Scare in the US, where communists were often portrayed as enemies within. While the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, communism did not disappear. Today, nations like China, Vietnam, Cuba, and North Korea still identify as communist or socialist, albeit with significant deviations from traditional Marxist principles. Communism remains one of the most debated ideologies in history. While it offered a vision of equality and social justice, its implementation often led to authoritarianism and economic challenges. The West's resistance was as much about preserving its own economic and political systems as it was about opposing human rights abuses and authoritarian rule. In short, the 20th century was a battleground, not just of wars and borders but of ideas. Two powerful ideologies went head-to-head in a struggle that shaped the modern world: communism and capitalism. Communism promised a world without classes, where workers owned the means of production. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 sparked this dream, leading to the birth of the Soviet Union, the first communist state. The seeds of this conflict were planted in the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution. As factories rose and cities expanded, so did inequality. Many workers toiled in dangerous conditions for low wages while a small elite grew increasingly wealthy. Watching this divide, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto alongside Friedrich Engels in 1848. Marx believed that capitalism was inherently exploitative and that history was a story of class struggle. His vision of communism imagined a world where workers controlled the means of production, wealth was shared, and classes were abolished. It was a radical idea that would inspire revolutions and movements across the globe. On the other side stood capitalism. Built on free markets, competition, and private ownership, capitalism drove economic growth in the West. The United States emerged as its champion, showcasing wealth, technology, and freedom. For decades, these two systems collided in the Cold War. The world held its breath as proxy wars raged and nuclear threats loomed. The Berlin Wall symbolized this divide, concrete proof of a world split in two. But by the late 1980s, communism began to crumble. The Soviet Union fell in 1991, and many declared the Cold War over. Capitalism had won. Or had it? Today the world is more complex. China, once a communist stronghold, has become an economic powerhouse by blending state control with market capitalism. Even capitalist nations have adopted social programs and regulations to address inequality and market failures. In the end, the battle between communism and capitalism didn't crown a single victor. Instead, the world adapted, creating hybrid systems, mixing competition with cooperation, and blending ideals to meet the challenges of today. For over a century, two powerful ideologies have battled for dominance: communism and capitalism. Their clash has not only shaped nations and economies, but also influenced the daily lives of billions of people. Today, we're diving deep into this epic struggle, exploring how it began, who came out on top, and why the story might not be over yet. So did capitalism win? In many ways, yes. Free markets, globalization, and consumer choice have become the dominant forces in the world economy. But the rise of economic inequality, climate challenges, and debates over workers' rights show that the story isn't over. In reality, the battle between communism and capitalism didn't end with a clear winner. It evolved. The world now exists in shades of gray, with hybrid systems attempting to balance competition with cooperation, individual freedom with collective responsibility. But history rarely offers such tidy conclusions. In the decades that followed, capitalism spread, but so did inequality. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of unregulated markets. Protests like Occupy Wall Street highlighted the frustrations of ordinary people who felt left behind by globalization. At the same time, China rose to prominence, not by adhering strictly to communist principles but by fusing state control with market strategies. The Chinese Communist Party maintained political power while allowing capitalism to flourish within its borders. The result was unprecedented economic growth, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. but also creating a new model of authoritarian capitalism. Today, the lines between communism and capitalism are more blurred than ever. Most countries operate in a mixed economy, combining market-driven practices with social welfare programs. In Europe, social democracies provide universal health care and education within a capitalist framework. In the U.S., debates continue over how much government intervention is needed in areas like healthcare, housing, and education. Meanwhile, some countries still hold on to communist ideals, though often in name only. Nations like North Korea and Cuba present a stark reminder of the extremes, while others like Vietnam blend state-led initiatives with open markets. What do you think? Did capitalism truly win, or are we living in a new era where the lines are more blurred than ever? Communism, as a political and economic ideology, has had several significant impacts in the countries where it was implemented. While its outcomes have been highly debated, and the systems built on communist principles often diverged from Marx's vision. Here are some key achievements often associated with communist states. Universal education. In many communist countries, education was made widely available to all citizens. Governments invested in free education systems, leading to higher literacy rates. In the Soviet Union, for example, illiteracy was almost eradicated, and in China, literacy rates improved dramatically after the communist takeover. Healthcare access. Communist regimes often provided universal healthcare, ensuring that medical services were available to everyone regardless of their social or economic status. The Soviet Union and Cuba are notable examples, where healthcare became a state-provided service, improving life expectancy and health outcomes in certain areas. Industrialization. Communist countries, especially the Soviet Union and China, prioritized industrialization and modernization of their economies. This led to rapid development in some sectors, especially heavy industry, infrastructure, and military production. While the methods were often harsh, such as collectivization or forced labor, they transformed economies from agrarian-based to industrial-based systems. Social equality. One of the core goals of communism is to eliminate class distinctions. In theory, communist systems strive for a society where the means of production are owned collectively, and wealth is more equally distributed. In some cases, this led to improvements in the standard of living for previously oppressed groups, such as women, workers, and peasants. Welfare and social security systems. Many communist regimes introduced strong social security programs, providing pensions, unemployment benefits, and other forms of social welfare. These systems were designed to offer security and stability for the working class, promotion of women's rights. In several communist countries, there was a concerted effort to promote gender equality. For instance, in the Soviet Union and Cuba, women were encouraged to participate in the workforce, and laws were passed to protect women's rights in marriage, employment, and education. Land reforms. In some cases, communist revolutions implemented radical land reforms. In China, land was redistributed from large landowners to peasants, aiming to create a more equitable agricultural system. These reforms were often violent and controversial, but did change the land ownership structures in many areas. Improved infrastructure. Communist governments often invested heavily in infrastructure projects, such as the construction of roads, bridges, public transportation, and housing. In many cases, this led to rapid urbanization and modernization of previously rural areas. International solidarity. Communism promoted international solidarity among workers and socialist movements. The idea of a workers' world led to the establishment of international organizations like the Comintern and various revolutionary movements across the globe, particularly in the 20th century. Despite these achievements, it's important to recognize that the outcomes of communist systems have often been mixed and controversial. The ideal of a classless, stateless society has not been fully realized, and in many cases authoritarian regimes emerged that contradicted the democratic elements of the communist ideology. Moreover, economic inefficiencies, human rights abuses, and repression of political freedoms were common in many communist regimes. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more updates.